Well, as I often say, I am really looking forward to this conversation. In this case, it's really true. My wonderful friend Terry Gatewood is with us. Terry is the founder and clinical director of Ridgeback Recovery in the Desert, and so much more. I've known Terry for quite a few years, and we've had a couple of very, very interesting conversations. And so I thought, hey, let's have an interesting conversation on the podcast. Welcome to the Element Q podcast. I'm your host, TJ Woodward, and I'm thrilled to have you join us for this empowering journey. Each week, we shine a light on the authors, thought leaders, therapists, coaches, and healers of all types who are making a difference in the LGBTQ plus community. Together, we honor those who came before us, the courageous and resilient trailblazers who stood for our rights and recognition. Their strength laid the foundation we stand on today. Here, we celebrate their legacy by diving into the stories, insights, and tools that inspire gentleness, healing, and transformation. So get ready to be uplifted and empowered. This is the Element Q podcast. Terry, welcome to the show.
Oh, TJ, thank you so much for asking me. This is such a pleasure. What a great way to kind of either see out the old year or bring in the new. So
that's right.
I'm excited to be here.
Thank you, Terry. Thank you. And thank you for your yes. I know that you've recently said that you're just committed to saying yes to things. And I just feel so grateful that timing worked out, that we have you here. When we were talking about the LGBTQ plus community and what this call for a deeper healing is, one of the things that you brought up, and I think it's such an important topic, is how much shame drives behavior. And how oftentimes the behavior is what we end up looking at rather than looking at the actual shame. And that to me is a shift from treating to healing. I know you work with a very specific population, and that is people who have sexual compulsivity and even sex offenders. And I feel so grateful that you are doing that work, because that group of people can often get stigmatized and then often neglected.
Oh, you're absolutely right. And especially in, when we talk about shame in the LGBTQ plus community, I mean, we all grow up. I mean, let's face it, our society, we've come a long way, but man, do we have a long way to go. And we still, many of those environments that have existed for centuries that have basically said, gay and lesbian people are an abomination. And then now all of the focus and frankly try to negative stigmatization of the trans community has just been piling on. And, unfortunately, our political environment these days is pretty hostile to our community. I mean, when they're taking off any reference to trans off the plaque at Stonewall Inn, I mean, where this all began, that's a pretty good indication that systematically now, even our government is trying to marginalize us, which, so a lot of people, I think, TJ, I'm sure you've heard a lot that, we've got gay marriage now. And so, what else y'all need to fight for or whatnot. And we can have all the pride parades and so forth going on. But then when the parade is gone and we're sweeping up the confetti, then the reality comes back in that there's still a lot of stigmatization, a lot of prejudice, a lot of discrimination, families that are torn apart. And, we still have one of the highest rates of teenage suicide, in the country. So those are all pretty good indicators that we still have a lot of work to do. And I'm so glad, that you're focusing on this, issue as well.
Well, thank you, Terry. Yeah, and as you were talking, I was thinking back to my high school days. Obviously, the political pendulum swings, right? You and I have been around long enough to see it swing different directions. And obviously, that's an important conversation. And then in the midst of that swinging, how do we stay centered right in the midst of it? And I was hearkening back to my high school days, and actually two young men, I guess boys, we were 16, 17, and 18, did commit suicide. And both of them, absolutely at the core of that was sexual orientation. Confusion, at least. And, one of them I know never really came out to anyone and did ultimately die by suicide. And so, like you, I think sometimes the general consensus is, and even myself, I will think, well, we've come so far. absolutely true. If I look at like
Yeah.
what mainstream media and the movies that are out right now that we get to see,
Oh yeah.
that honestly, it's been emotional for me to see the depiction in such a positive way. And as you said, there's more to do. And I think what I want to invite us to kind of focus on, the more to do, how it relates to the shame and how
Yeah.
do we as a community and then also individually work with and heal that shame.
Well, and here's a good, I guess, segue into also, the sex offender piece when for decades, and it still happens, when a guy has so much shame about his sexual orientation, being someone who has sex with other men, um, is inclined to have sex in public. And, that had been going on for years before we had the apps, before anybody would even want to feel comfortable going to gay bars and meet people and so forth. And so they were having sex in public places, which I'm certainly not condoning. It's just a situation that because of the shame, because of what they feel like the stigma is, that they're putting themselves in high risk situations and they're being labeled sex offenders
Yeah.
and oftentimes being put on the sex offender registry, which that's a huge topic too about how now the registry has become monetized by third party for profit groups, and it's a real problem. How some people who are not a threat to children at all are being placed on this and being stigmatized for the rest of their lives. So that stigma, that shame, is only magnified. But we do a lot of work when clients come in. Um, we do an exercise called their timeline, and it is everything from birth all the way up to present. And we look at several different categories in trying to find where would maybe some of those personal events or traumatic events, and they could be positive or negative. I mean, it could be, a divorce of the parents, could be winning the Little League baseball game, whatever those events start to form our core belief, especially when we're around 5 to 8, most egocentric. And, so if something good happens, oh, wow, I'm a great kid and, I'm a good guy. Something bad happens, and especially if it's from our parents, as children, we have to think, oh, it must be me that's bad because for me to be safe, for me to be taken care of, my parents and everybody else is supposed to be good because they got to take care of me. So when I explain that to clients and when we look at certain events that happen, and also, I've been a certified sex addiction therapist now for, gosh, about 16 years. And so when we look at it, it's like, when do they become hypersexualized? And TJ, you and I, as you were referring to, the pendulum in our ages,
Yeah.
I think we were very fortunate that we didn't grow up with the internet.
Yeah.
By 94, when it was coming out, because frankly, porn may have been magazines and then VHS tapes or whatever, but it certainly wasn't on one of these.
Yeah. It's
Yeah.
funny. We had to work hard to get our porn. I mean, that's
Right?
seriously like hiding
Right?
magazines under the bed and all of that when I was in my teenage years. As you were talking, I was thinking about a couple of things that are really important that I would love to kind of explore further. One is this idea of being so young and absorbing and deciding these huge things about ourselves. And what you're alluding to and speaking to, I think, is so important because our brains aren't even developed when we're that young. And we do have
Right.
very much concrete thinking. Mommy's upset, I must be bad. It's very concrete in that way. And then we make these massive decisions. We come into recovery, we come into treatment, we go to therapy, maybe it's a spiritual journey. And then oftentimes we try to address it cerebrally or through the mind. And yet our minds weren't even developed. So, really,
Exactly.
it was so, in many cases pre-verbal. I mean, my own personal sexual trauma is at age 3 years old, and I spent my first decade of recovery from age 20 to 30 trying to figure out what happened. And at some point, I realized it was so much deeper than that because it was really in my body, and I don't
Exactly.
have an exact memory. But because I didn't have an exact memory, I spent a lot of time minimizing that or saying maybe it never happened or I wonder why I have this response or this reaction. More longer into my recovery, of course, I started to realize that the body was giving me the information I needed. The
Exactly.
other thing that I wanted to touch on, and I don't know if I've ever talked about this publicly, so I'm going to be bold here, especially because there's a show out right now that's very hot in the gay world, and
Heated, isn't it? It's very heated.
very heated, yes.
Very
When
heated.
I was 18, I met a professional football player, and he was a starting football player, and we had a 1 year secret affair. Now, the reason that I call it, I don't know that it was an affair. We were hooking up for a year, but it was secret, and that's the key. Because of my own trauma and because of the shame I experienced growing up, not just being a little gay kid in Indiana in the 1970s, but also a lot of the sexual shame that came from the men in my family. There, it was the perfect storm for me to then eroticize and then ultimately choose relationships that needed to be secret. It's what
Right.
I felt like I deserved. Now, of course, I can look back and say it's kind of hot that I was with this,
Yeah.
professional football player who was a starting player and playing, and all of that was really, I eroticized that so much, Terry. But looking back, I realized how much of that was driven by shame. I didn't deserve to have a real relationship. That's what I believed.
And TJ, one of the things that we find too that of young gay men who, when they come into treatment, that have a history of being sexually abused when they were in 8, 9, 10, and sometimes maybe it continues. And when it gets to that point where, because then they start to realize, oh, I'm gay. I have this attraction. Here's this person that knows me, knows what I'm into, knows what I'm attracted to, appreciates me, makes me feel special. And so then, and of course, it's aligned with their orientation. So the kid starts to, I almost want to say, pursue
Yeah.
or kind of invite, and want that to continue. As he gets older, the older person, and it could be an older teenager, it could be an adult, that all of a sudden it's like, hey, kid, you're about to blow our cover, get away from me. And then
Mm.
they have that shame of like being rejected, but then they also have the shame later on that they don't realize they were abused because they said, "Oh, it wasn't abuse. I liked it. I consented. I pursued. I like started going after him. He had to tell me to cut it out."
Yeah.
And I was like, "No, your frontal cortex was nowhere near developed. You couldn't figure out. That's why people under 18, and do you know, a little side note, do you know there's only 11 states in the country where the legal age for sex is 18?
I know it's lower in many other states, right?
It's like most of them were 16 or 17.
Yeah.
There were two at 14. But of course, sexual attraction is all about biologically, it's about pubescence, it's about the ability to have sex. And that, on average happens by the age of 14. So sexual attraction for those is not deviant or abnormal, but it is certainly problematic. And there's a reason for that. So, dealing with the shame that this kid has for being gay, then and expressing that, and even the person that he thought it was okay with is now rejecting him. And so guys come in and they, as you say, I mean, feel like everything has to be secret. It has to be anonymous. Certainly entering into a romantic relationship with a person of the same sex is just, the cognitive dissonance that I think our community has early on, when they, until they're able to overcome that and really internalize that they are good and worthy. And that's one of the things that we focus on. we focus on in that timeline, where is it? What events happened? And how do you think that little kid, I tell them, come up here. We're going to be like observing.
Yeah.
We've got our little pad and pencil. We're like scientists. Let's come out from over it. You're not feeling the emotion. And let's just kind of look down and, wow, this happened to that little boy. How do you think that little boy would feel? How do you think that little girl would feel by that happening? My gosh, I mean, girls, it is astounding. And I think people, we just gloss over. And one of the things with the Epstein files coming out, which I got to tell you, just a bit of a note, it's so ironic to me that supporters of a certain person who is probably, was a pedophile's best friend, um, are so like, if you talk about pedophile, they're like just foam at the mouth. I'm like, but how do you justify that with, anyway, as you can tell, it's very frustrating because when guys come into Ridgeback, you know, and they have this stigma and they have people, I mean, death threats. And so in their communities, if the arrest was high profile, so which I get a lot of those that are public in the news on the TV station. And these people that are vilifying them, um, supported someone who was found guilty of sexual assault.
Yeah.
It's mind-boggling. But go ahead.
Well, I mean, I think one of the things, that you're speaking to is how layered this conversation is. And I remember one time, Terry, I was actually at this interfaith breakfast, and someone from the VA came to speak, and the person said veterans get lifelong benefits unless they're sex offenders. And so my hand flies up and I'm like, well, what happens if they're sex offenders? Would they lose their benefits? So we're now going to take a shame-based behavior and marginalize it even further and punish. And this is such a layered conversation because neither one of us are saying that what happened in the act is okay, but we're looking at how we can heal it. Because if we only punish, separate, and create more shame, nothing ever gets healed. And the cycle of the sexual trauma is going to continue. We see that in families, we see that in systems, and we see that in our culture. And I think of course, there are acts that that seem so heinous that it's a natural thing to want to like push this person aside. But that isn't really how we heal this, because when we are in victim perpetrator, when we're in that conversation, and that's the only place we take it, there isn't any healing there. I'm not
Exactly.
saying that someone doesn't need to be held accountable for their behavior. Obviously, they do. But when we add this when we stigmatize it even further, then we're just adding more shame to the shame. And simply said, shame doesn't heal shame; it just keeps it alive.
Absolutely. And now then, what do we classify as
Yeah,
sex offenses? We were talking earlier. I mean, back in our day, even to get a hold of porn, you had to work at it.
yeah,
To get a hold of child pornography, or which we call CSAM now, child sexually abuse material,
mm,
um, that you had to be, like find some connection back in a dark alley, a vanilla envelope, and they were mainly Polaroids or so, because how are they going to reproduce them? I mean, you had to really work at it. And those guys that are willing to work at it at that level are definitely probably fixated pedophiles.
yeah,
The thing about it is there are different categories of offenders, whether, and everybody thinks when they hear pedophile, they think of the violent predator that was responsible for Megan's Law that came about, in which the whole registry came about. The registry is not made for someone who urinated in public,
yeah,
although some prosecutors put them on the registry, charged them with a sex offense. It was made for violent sexual predators that would kidnap, torture, rape, and murder children. And that's what it's appropriate for.
right.
But even the California Sex Offender Management Board, the way the registry, and even now in California, we have three tiers, and the third tier is made for the most heinous and the violent predator. and that's a lifetime registry. So you also have a 5 or a 10 year, tier one and tier two. But even, luckily the California Supreme Court did away with the residential requirements. You can do it on a case by case basis. Unfortunately, some municipalities are still enforcing it, and they're being sued and so forth because it's created another stigma, homelessness, unemployment. I mean, we want these people to be able to reintegrate because the vast majority are not pedophiles.
Yeah.
I know it's hard to kind of the rationale that, oh, if somebody is looking at child porn, they must be a pedophile.
Mm.
And that's simply not the case. I mean, most guys, and of course, as I said, non-deviant sexual attraction is from 14 and above. So those that register 13 or younger, we do screening right off the bat when they come for treatment. We do testing that looks at sexual attraction, which is beyond their awareness. So it's not
Mm.
like they can game the test. And it's broken up in 0 to 5, 6 to 13, 14 to 17, and adult. And there are some that if they're in that 6 to 13 or even 0 to 5, but they've been a porn addict. And I tell you, folks, if you've given your child one of these without parental controls, without software, monitoring software, so that and you're not up to date with all the apps that they can hide things with and everything on their phone, if you think, oh, well, I check their phone every now and then, you have increased dramatically the risk of your child becoming a porn addict.
Well,
Dramatic.
and I want to lean into that because now the generation who grew up on the internet is fully adult, right? So the
Right.
first generation, and I know you personally are seeing the effect of that. I only have that sort of like as an idea of I can't even imagine or I can imagine what happens when a child in these developmental years is being inundated with images of pornography way before their system can actually handle it. We talked about the brain not being developed, right? So, like, if we start to wire the brain for that and become desensitized to it, I can just see like how large of an issue this can become over time. So that's one thing. But I do want to ask a bold question, and it's
Okay.
only a bold question because of how the general population feels about this. Can sex offenders, and I know you're talking about all these different layers, and sometimes people get labeled that when we wouldn't even necessarily think they should fit into that category. But when they are labeled that, the question I have this bold is can they heal? Can
Oh,
we heal them?
absolutely.
Because a lot of people don't believe they can, and that's a big part of the issue.
Well, exactly. A lot of people think again, and it's hard, and I get it. It's a reasonable thought that if somebody has been looking at child pornography, that they are sexually attracted to that age group.
Yeah.
That's reasonable, but it's not always correct. Sexual attraction is very different from sexual orientation. And a lot of folks in the public think that if somebody has pedophilic tendencies, which, by the way, pedophilia itself is not in the DSM,
Mm.
unless they act upon that, that's when it becomes a disorder. But so if we have the kid that started out with porn, and now it used to be the average age was 11 for most boys being exposed to porn.
Yeah.
It's still girls are coming up in as far as becoming addicted to porn, but they're still only about 15 to 20% of the population of what we know. So boys at the age of 11. Since COVID, it is believed that that number, and they're still trying to do some research to see where it's at now, but it's to believe it could be 8 or 9. So, and that's as an average. So I have clients that were hypersexualized at the age of 5 because they found their parents' porn or their older brother thought it would be funny to expose them to that or, friends. And of course, I mean, it's sort of like that exposure kind of spreads like measles in a school. When one, oh, look at this, or hey, this is what I've got on my iPad and so forth. And once that brain and that boy gets on there and it starts, and I do this as an escalation, they start looking at, and of course, if they're looking at child porn at that age, if they were actually having sex with another 8-year old, it would be like, okay, that's inappropriate, but we wouldn't criminalize it. I mean, it's sexual or exploration, even as they're getting older. I mean, yes, it's illegal for a 20-year-old to have sex with a 15-year-old. It's not illegal for a 17-year-old to have sex with a 15-year-old, as long as it's consensual. So there's a lot of mixed messages that go on, especially, even for teenagers. But with porn, now that they're so exposed to it, and by the way, for anybody, even adults that are looking at age appropriate porn, the pop up windows, you don't have to go searching for it, and especially, in our community, for some that are meth addicts,
Yeah.
when you get in that crazed state of mind, you are not thinking rationally and you're spinning and a pop-up window comes up and if you can go down that, you may like spin into that rabbit hole. And then next thing because when I say up here of the escalation, it's not the sexual arousal piece that is the escalation. It's the taboo-ness. It's the
Mhm.
stigma. That is what, because I believe in our treatment, we look at the core beliefs. What are the mistaken core beliefs that we need to work on and change through affirmation, through a lot of self-esteem work, and then realize, oh, you were going after what you thought you were so bad and unworthy. And looking at child porn, acting upon child is the worst. That is like the worst.
Yeah, and you're speaking, of course, with my model conscious recovery, it's very in alignment because I do a lot of work on what our core false beliefs are that are not only a narrative or a thought, but they're a frequency or the way we actually hold ourselves. It's alive in our bodies, and we can't
Exactly.
choose anything other than something congruent with the core false belief because we're always choosing unconsciously or consciously. So if I
Yep.
believe I'm unworthy, if I believe I'm not good enough, if I believe I'm unlovable, that's what I will choose. And the thing about shame is we often say, I feel ashamed that I did that. But the truth is, I did that because I had shame. And then I have more shame. And then that's where a lot of times, like you're talking about, then it becomes the taboo piece. And then there's more secrecy. And that like intensifies the shame. So we're on this downward shame spiral, and then everything's in secrecy. And you
Yep.
know, the only way that we actually heal shame is to create a safe environment like Ridgeback or like other places where someone can come and actually bring it to the surface in a safe and loving environment. And some of it can be so taboo and so shameful that people might hold that with them their entire lives. And I think about that
Mhm.
and think about what people are holding. And it's no wonder we have so much going on in our country and in our world as a result of that.
Absolutely. There was back in, I believe it was 2008, Assembly Bill 1775 was introduced and passed, which added to the exceptions to confidentiality that a therapist must maintain. And those exceptions are abuse of a minor, abuse of an elder, or homicidality where you have to alert them or the authorities.
Yeah.
Those were the three. Well, AB 1775 added that if somebody comes in and says they've looked at one image of child pornography or what they thought may have been child pornography, then the therapist was supposed to um, uh, report, add that to the mandated reporting. And so several of my colleagues were plaintiffs in suing the state. And it's at the U.S. Supreme Court, and it's still in, they sent it, said, look, state, you got to prove that this reduces viewership and production. And so, and of course, how are they going to do that? But so it's such a harmful law. Because if people are coming in to therapy for treatment because their porn addiction or their behavior has gotten to the point where they do not, they're afraid that, oh my gosh, how did I get to looking at this? Is there something wrong with me? I don't want to harm a child. I have no desire to do that. I need help. And so it's really discouraging people. They're not going to come in if they feel like, hey, if I tell the therapist this. So there are so many people out there not getting help because of unhelpful laws, as such. Most of the guys that we get have been arrested, are not the case of like, they haven't been a CPS or a DCFS case or the like. Most of them are. But when they come in and we test where their sexual attraction is, because guess what? Our sexual attraction changes as we get older. It changes, as we experience new things. Maybe we were into blondes and blue eyed. Maybe now we're into olive skin and dark hair or whatever. Based on our experiences, our sexual attraction changes. And so, yes, there are, and I want to be clear, there are dedicated pedophiles that I would say of all of the ones that I have encountered in my 16 years in doing this, I've encountered 3 dedicated pedophiles. And so what did we do? We didn't say, oh, you should be lenient. I said, one in particular, this guy needs to go to prison for a minimum of 5 years and then never be alone with a minor ever.
Yeah.
He must always be supervised. And then for some of these guys that may be a dedicated pedophile, which we call fixated, then, but they don't want to harm a child, touch a child, then we do safety plans. Safety plans for them and the community to make sure that everybody stays safe. And so we can determine those that need certain kind of treatment, which is more structured, especially in the community. And then those that are coming in that have a porn addiction or, have been chatting online and people think that, oh, I'm chatting and it's just make believe and this isn't serious. But then, I can tell your viewers, folks, if you're on there chatting with somebody and you start going down, you've got to think that person is probably a sting operation,
Yeah.
whether it's from a vigilante group or from law enforcement. And they will take hold of the conversation and try to pull you in. And the thing about it, and I have to say, TJ, I understand law enforcement's predicament. They are charged with keeping the community safe. And they are charged, certainly, and they have taken this, in which I take my hat off to them. I feel for law enforcement that has to review all these hard drives and the phones and look at this material. I don't know how they do it.
Yeah.
And in working, so my hat, I greatly appreciate them. But they're kind of treating, if somebody got into a conversation that then went sexual in nature, and maybe they thought they were talking to a 15-year-old, and it turns out not to be, treating that person who never had a record, doesn't have any child porn on their phone, made a stupid mistake because they were drunk or high or otherwise, and then they're now facing jail time and lifetime registry for that one event. And I get it, because what they're trying to do is, oh, if this person said, yeah, let's meet up at this hotel or something, and whether they go there or not, I understand, to keep children safe, they feel like, oh, if this person comes to me for whatever reason, then, or even if they're talking about it, we need to arrest them and make sure they don't. The problem is so many people are kind of getting swept up in this net that are not danger to children. They're sure stupid and they make really stupid mistakes.
Yeah.
and so forth. But it's such a complicated thing because, it's getting to the point now with porn addiction and child porn coming in. I bet it's not going to be long, TJ, before everybody knows somebody who has done this behavior and has, the ramifications for it. And so, I got to say, accountability, I mean, for any addiction, accountability is very helpful.
Yeah,
And when you were talking about shame, we like to shift it out of shame and into guilt.
that's right. That's right.
Guilt's a very healthy thing. Feel bad about what you did. Feel like this is not my values. This is not who I am. And that will hopefully keep you from doing it again. Do you know that less than 10% of all hands-on sexual offenses with minors, less than 10% are done by those that have been charged and convicted.
Wow.
Less than 10%.
Wow. Well, Terry, my goodness, I know this has been an incredible conversation for me. And I feel like we have to do a part two at some point because there's
Oh, I'd
so
love to.
much, there's so many layers. And honestly, there are so few people who I personally know who are on the front lines in this conversation as you are. And so I just want to say thank you because we end up often treating who we perceive to be the victim in sexual, trauma and sexual events like I experienced. I was that person that had to heal that. But I think a lot of times when we move to looking at what we label as the offender, and obviously, as you said, it's very layered. And thank you for being really clear about like, yes, there is a percentage of people where the appropriate thing is to be in prison and to be very much accountable for their behavior. But there's also this other group of people where we know we can actually help them. And being able to help them actually is the prevention of these things happening to minors. And that, of
Absolutely.
course, is all of us are wanting that. So you're invited back. We want to do a
Oh,
part
I'd love
two.
to. I'd love to.
I want to ask you if there's anything you want to say in closing. Of course, your bio and your contact information will be in the show notes, but is there anything, Terry, you want to say in closing?
One last thing that I think the big population that's also left out in this discussion are the family members of those that are charged.
Oh,
The
yeah.
family members that the trauma that they go through, because many times they're hauled out of the house and on there when the SWAT team comes, or even the stigma. So that's one of the things we're working on a program to address the trauma for the families that I think are kind of left out in the discussion.
Yeah, and you spoke to also, first responders in this case are the people investigating these crimes, and they're being exposed and traumatized from that as well, the
Exactly.
investigators. And as you said, like how to work with all the layers of that. If there's any takeaway for me, it's like there's not a one size fits all with this. It's very layered,
Right.
it's very complex. And you have so eloquently given me, I know personally, and therefore I know our viewers and our listeners so much to be with. And I invite anyone watching or listening right now to do your own research and your exploration. There are things, Terry, that you said that I was completely unaware of until today. And that helps me, as someone working with clients and someone who wants to hold the highest possibility for healing for all people. So, Terry, thank you so much. I appreciate
Uh,
you. And I thank you
Thank
for
you,
saying
TJ.
yes to your work and saying yes to this podcast. Everyone, you know what to do. Like, subscribe, and please share this episode. It's an important one. Peace and blessings, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this episode of the Element Q podcast. It's an honor to walk this path of healing and transformation with you. Remember, the courage and resilience of those who came before us live on in each of us. Let's continue to carry their legacy forward as we support one another in creating a world filled with love, gentleness, and empowerment. If you enjoyed today's conversation, please subscribe, leave a review, and share this podcast with someone who needs to hear it. Together, we're building a brighter future, one story at a time. Until next time, I'm TJ Woodward, and this has been the Element Q podcast.